So you guys are all familiar with Kara Walker. Do you like her work?
Yes.
Yeah.
I wish I knew more about it, so I'm glad
All right.
going into Kara Walker.
So she was born and raised in a very racially diverse and comfortable community in California, and then when she was 13, they moved to Atlanta. And even before they moved, she was scared. The idea of living in the South was scary, and they got there and she found herself in an environment where she was suddenly exposed to active, present, constant racism. And she said that that really shaped her development as an artist.
How old was she when they moved there again?
Sorry?
How old was she?
She was 13. It's a tough age. So, it's a difficult work to document, as is the case with many of her works, but here we can see it. There's just sort of one guy who's falling off the edge. Also, I'll show you an example of this in a minute, but it's installed differently in different places. She does her installations herself. She makes her work by herself, which today is unusual for an artist of her prominence. And so we see the figures in different orders, in different contexts. This is an anonymous painting called Darkytown that she found in a book that she was like, this is really interesting. I find this curious, odd little painting of Darkytown compelling. And she drew from it to create this rebellion in Darkytown. Now, she's drawing on stereotype, right? Intensely. And the history of stereotype as applied to African Americans in the United States is much like stereotype as applied to Native Americans, really intense. It's been around for a long time, and it can be quite brutal. I just wanted to talk briefly about minstrel shows, something that I learned about the cakewalk. Do you guys know what the cakewalk is? A popular dance in minstrel shows. And the origin of the cakewalk is really interesting in relation to Walker's work and the stereotypes that she's engaging with. The cakewalk originated amongst slaves who were making fun of their masters, who were imitating their sort of self-important, precious ways. And whites, on seeing these behaviors, assumed that they were just the slaves being funny, and then they appropriated the appropriations. There's this sort of wild cyclical thing going on that's partly grounded in a white slave culture not really understanding the culture of their slaves. They don't need to. Whereas if you're a slave, you need to understand the culture of your owners. Right? If you want to survive, you need to know how these people work. And so within the history of minstrelsy is this very unbalanced power relationship in terms of representation and appropriation. I have a couple of images that are distressing. A heads up, I don't know if you would want to use them or how much you talk about the history of lynching in the US, but I do think if we're going to talk about Kara Walker, we do have to be sort of honest with ourselves about the depth and the sort of grotesque nature of the violence that took place in the 20th century. So this is a drawing of a lynching from 1934, a watercolor. There were two exhibitions held in the 1930s that were exhibitions against lynching. One was held by the NAACP, and it was a more conservative exhibition, and the other was organized by the John Birch Society, which was a communist American organization that was much more sort of aggressive in its imagery. This one would have been from the John Birch exhibition. This work by Osamu Noguchi, who many of you probably know as a man who made lamps and tables, but he was very politically active.
Doesn't he also do abstract stone?
Yes, yes, modernist sculpture. And people tend to think of him in terms of abstraction and design. But when the Japanese internment camps were set up during World War II, he wasn't sent to them. He was too important and powerful, and he was like, no, I'm going to go because I'm also Japanese American. And then he gave up and left because it was too awful. So all those stories about how they weren't that bad, maybe not so true. But here you can see this is probably based on this image. So men, sometimes women, the story of Mary Turner is a very distressing one. it would be hung and then burned. And so the form of this body depicted by Noguchi is the product of having been burned. Which one? This one? This was a postcard. Yeah, there are so many postcards.
Locks of their hair.
And like little, oh, we had a barbecue tonight. They're really awful, really deeply distressing images. Ken Gonzalez-Day is a contemporary artist who's taken many of these images, not like this one. He's used the ones where people are, lynch mobs are posing under the bodies, like, ha, look what we did. And he removes the body so that all you see is the lynch mob. So instead of this sort of re-victimization and objectification of bodies that have already been objectified, he takes them out. And so you just focus on the people who at this point matter in the picture, the perpetrators of the crime. So here are two examples of Darkytown Rebellion. It's interesting. I think that this work was selected because it's the one with the least sexual content of her work that I was able to find. It's more ambiguous. Well, they're all ambiguous, but we don't see images of explicit sort of fecal and sexual action going on as we often do. It's a sort of safer work. So you can see she's organized them differently in these two different installations. But I'd like to talk about the projection. Why do you think not all of her installations involve this kind of projection of brightly colored light? Why do you think that she's used it here? What effect would it have?
In a way, what the subject matter is a projection of stereotypes upon the whole race of people.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that has projections.
I think too, those beautiful colors draw you into the room. And
They're
not
seductive.
In the middle of this gorgeous light show, do you realize you're looking at something really ugly?
Yeah. I mean, I do think that that issue of projection, the form that she uses, these cutouts, are made through projection. You sit and somebody shines a light against your face and they outline your profile. And when I was a little kid, my grandparents had somebody do it to me. So that's the sort of traditional mode of creating these silhouette images. So we do have a kind of double projection. It, as you said, it's enticing, it's seductive, and she's very interested in the capacity for art to seduce, to draw people in with beauty, and then to reveal itself to be something much darker. Anything else? Any other? Yeah.
I was going to say, when you enter into a space like this, it feels like you're entering into a story. It's about storytelling. And I feel like especially the colors of the light give it even more of that whimsical kind of fairy tale effect. But like you said, is quite different when you understand what's happening.
Yes. So it's like you're in a kind of forest glade almost. But also, once you're in it, you're physically in it. You become a part of it. Your shadow is going to show up on the wall in very explicit ways. So there is a sense that once you're in, you can't remove yourself from the history. You can't sort of distance yourself and be like, oh, that was a long time ago. It has nothing to do with me. Because she's not. These are about history, but they're not historical. She's not giving us a true account of things that happened. She's exploring the ways in which the history of slavery have sort of occupied or infested our imaginations in our contemporary culture. Oh, so many notes. Okay, some of them I'll come back to. I want to do a little bit of formal analysis as much as we can, although this one is, I find it difficult to make out because of the colored lights in reproduction. But what can we read? What figures can we describe here? Like, who's she?
She's a wealthy woman.
Yeah,
With the
the white
hustle,
woman.
and the man behind her
Mm-hmm.
striding is in some sort of suit. Very
Is he
vertical.
missing a leg?
Yeah, is his leg
Oh,
lying
a
behind him?
Yeah.
Dismembered.
Oh, there's
Yes, he's missing a leg. marching along. What about this one? Well, so with this kid, you can't tell if the arm is missing or if it's just folded in, right? And often we can't tell. It's been noted a number of times that we can't tell which leg is missing, right? This is the issue with the silhouette. We're missing tons of information. There's a lot of information we don't have, and yet we have enough to make out power relationships, to make out race in most cases. How are we able to distinguish black from white in these works? Okay, so the hair, clothing, lips. That's certainly often the case in her work. It's not as pronounced in this piece as in some, although I think we can see it a little bit here. Also, this exaggerated physiognomy is sort of associated with racial stereotype. So if we think back to that idea of a sort of essentialist vision of race, she is reminding us again, it's not color, right? These are all the same color. They're all flat black images. That the ways in which we read and understand race are tied to a much more complex set of signifiers. That we can often identify or think we can identify race through voice, fashion choices, gait, right? We have come sort of subconsciously to build up these associations. She, talking about this work that she was making, she started out as a painter, and she abandoned painting because she couldn't deal with the baggage. And I remember when I was in art school, a lot of my peers were like, I can't deal with the baggage. Painting just comes with too much baggage. What would that baggage be?
History.
History. But whose history? I mean, whose history do we see in paintings? Yeah, it's a pretty exclusive bunch. I mean, we treat paintings as like the center of all art, and yet they're made by such a small group of people, such a small selection of the people in the world, right? We associate with this tradition of painting. And she wanted to get away from that. She wanted to get away from the kinds of expectations and demands that came from painting. So there's that shift away from painting that moves her towards these images, and towards this method of the paper cutout, which has been around for centuries as a mode of portraiture. It was often a less expensive version of the cameo. It was never an expensive art form, and it was never an art form that required great expertise in terms of portraiture. You just need to be able to follow a line with a pencil. It's pretty straightforward. You guys should do an exercise. I want to do an exercise. I want to do it. Anyways, by the 20th century, it was associated with craft traditions. And craft traditions have historically, I'm just going to skip forward to this, been associated with women and non-Western people. These are the art forms of the other, or craft. So this is an example of, oh, I'm sorry, the label's not there. It didn't show up. This is a work by Judy Chicago called The Dinner Party. Is it in your curriculum?
It's no longer.
Oh, too bad. Okay, good. And so what she's done is she's rewriting history with a focus on women, and sort of women from throughout history. And she's using china painting and embroidery as the primary forms. And she did that because, like the silhouette cutout, this is a form not associated with the grand tradition of the museum, right? But instead, everyday, domestic, and often feminine activities. Okay. So, have you guys read about, well, first let's just do a comparison before we dig into that. Are you guys familiar with this work? Betty Saar's Liberation of Aunt Jemima? It's a small work, just to give you a sense of what's happening here. She purchased, this is like to put next to the phone back when people had phones. There would be a pad of paper here and a pencil or a pen here. So this is one of these racist tchotchkes that you can buy still in many antique stores. And Logan, Utah has some amazing collections of super racist memorabilia in their antique stores. So she buys this, but she transforms it, right? What has she done with Aunt Jemima?
Given her a gun.
Yeah, 2, in fact. She also has a pistol. Okay, so she's given and who is Aunt Jemima? What is she known for? Syrup, pancakes. Who is she modeled after? What historical figure? Sorry? The mammy, yes. The domestic house slave who takes care of the children and cooks and is jolly and happy and loves her job. Sorry? So in Gone with the Wind, right, there is a famous mammy figure. And Kara Walker is really interested in that book. She said she read it and she was really swept away by the fact that the narrative just took her with it, and this sense of identifying with Scarlett O'Hara in really intense ways. But then every now and then there's this line set down that is like, things I won't say in public or in front of a camera, the really disgusting, horrible, racist things. So she had this experience of being seduced by the story and hating it, of wanting to be Scarlett O'Hara and wanting to kill Scarlett O'Hara, right? This really intense sort of internal splitting or dissonance. Now, this is earlier, this is 1972, and Betty Saar is identifying here with the figure of the mammy, but she's made her a revolutionary. She's given her weapons, and what's going on with the skirt? It's a Black Power salute. So Betty Saar, like Kara Walker, is using and repurposing racist stereotypes. Kara Walker also collects these kinds of things, and they're inspirational to her. But Betty Saar really, really hated Kara Walker's work. Have you guys followed this controversy at all? So Betty Saar and a number of other pioneering African-American women artists who came to prominence in the 1970s were just like, this is not okay. This is unacceptable, the work that she's doing. And I'll read you quotes. I think that that's better than paraphrasing. So Betty Saar has said of Walker, "I felt the work of Kara Walker was sort of revolting and negative and a form of betrayal to the slaves, particularly women and children. That it was basically for the amusement and the investment of the white art establishment." And Howardina Pindell, another artist from the same period, said, "What is troubling and complicates the matter is that Walker's words in published interviews mock African Americans and Africans. She has said things such as, 'All black people in America want to be slaves a little bit.' Walker consciously or unconsciously seems to be catering to the bestial fantasies about blacks created by white supremacy and racism." So there have been a number of these critiques that, in fact, Kara Walker's work replicates the stereotypes and the racism that, we've been working so hard to undermine, to reject. Instead of empowering figures like this, she's often subjecting them to, horrible indignities, grotesque indignities. And we'll look at a couple of images that you probably can't show in school. So what is the purpose of this kind of action? Is it legitimate? Or do you think she is in fact catering to the white art establishment?
I think that it puts it right in front of our face and makes us admit that that's what really happened. And as ugly as it is, it's part of our history, and a lot of it is, regardless, part of our lives, because we were kind of brainwashed by the government, you know?
It is incredibly complicated. I mean, the idea of being brainwashed by the government in terms of racism, how can a government make us racist, right? It can participate, but I think one of the things that she's getting at is that it's so deeply embedded in sort of the traditions of American life and experience. It's in Gone with the Wind. It's in junk shops. It's everywhere. And as was the case with Native American artists who can't get rid of the stereotypes of colonial culture, but instead have to process them, because you can't just make them go away, Walker is potentially processing this material. She's like, it's there, it's in all of us. So we can pretend it's not there. We can all say, oh, I'm not racist. Or we can actually deal with the fact that we have this really ugly, complicated history that isn't just history, it's part of contemporary American psychology and everyday experience. And again, it goes way back, historically. Are you guys familiar with Sarah Bartman or Saartjie Bartman? A little bit, the Venus, the Hottentot Venus? So she was a woman who was picked up in Africa and paraded around Europe in wonder and awe at her extraordinarily giant buttocks, right? She was intensely eroticized and sexualized and subjected to sort of pseudo-scientific analysis. All of it, again, when we talk about objectification, in the sense she's just not a human being. She's just a specimen, an extraordinary, a wonder specimen. But, I mean, do you think that there are ways in which Kara Walker's engagement with that stereotype is tied to contemporary culture?
I think of Nicki Minaj.
And just like music video culture in general, this really intense focus on black women's butts. It's out of control. And there also was a run, there's Nicki Minaj, but like 3 or 4 years ago, there was a run of white female artists who, so Miley Cyrus, Taylor Swift, and another one who's British, I forget her name. And they all sort of feature themselves between the jiggling brown buttocks of African American women in their videos. That kind of imagery wouldn't be as seductive as it is if it weren't for this long history of the excessive eroticization and sexualization of black women's bodies, grounded in this really kind of bizarre transformation of a human being into a specimen, in the case of the Hottentot Venus or Saartjie Bartman. Narrative is, we're not going to pin down an exact narrative. Keep in mind, again, that she moves them around, right? There isn't a linear progression. But what we're looking for are relationships, right? And especially ambiguities within relationships. So, for instance, over here, this is the clearest image I could collect. How are they, what is their relationship to one another? Who is addressing who? How are they arranged spatially? What is the relationship between this figure and this one?
He's following you.
This looks like, it's like a little jockey,
Yeah, he does look
right? Little guy with a whip. And where's his face? Is his face in her butt? Or is he like off to the side? We can't tell what the actual proximity is because we can't tell. It looks like there's some space in this direction. The battery is dying, I think, on my mic. It sounded like a dying battery.
I still hear you.
Okay, cool. Now this guy, he's missing a leg. He just lost it.
He doesn't seem concerned about that, though.
How is he walking? What is his posture? What is his stance? He's striding, he's strong, he's muscular, right? He's powerful. So how do we read this figure in the history of the representation of male slaves? What kind of figure can we see him playing?
Certainly the ideal male slave is one who is big and strong. That was the type they needed. And so, he's going to be, he's either going to be your best worker or your most problematic one, because he's going to be the one leading the rebellion and all of those sort of like work slowdowns and sabotage.
Right. So we have the sense he's strong, he's powerful, so he could be either dangerous to the institution of slavery, or he could be its greatest tool. What about his missing leg?
Was that a result of his uppityness?
Could be.
Well, a lot of times when they ran away, they jump off their feet.
And she actually, in a number of her other works, you see legs. There are other pieces where we see legs cut off. So I think that's a good connection, an ugly connection, but a worthwhile one to make. So he's striding without a leg. This sense he can keep going even in situations of extreme duress. And again, there is that possibility that it could go either way. Right? Does he revolt because he is pushed too far? Does he revolt because freedom and then loses his leg? We don't have an absolute narrative. We have to construct it as we go along. And I would certainly encourage students to engage in that process. What's going on here? Can you make out what's happening? What is she doing with this thing? What's at her feet?
Looks like a body with hands reaching up her feet.
It looks like a small child on its back. And she's raising this stick, right? So she is by far the most refined, the most genteel of the characters, but when we look at them all, she appears to be the one, when we realize that's not just a patch of grass, acting with the greatest, the most terrible violence. Let's see if we can hear. Nope.
Did you say it always looks the same? Or
No, it looks different.
change depending on the installation?
It depends on the installation, and the installation itself changes. The order of the figures changes in different installations. And she's spoken about that, and she said she has anxiety, and I might have a quote here. I don't, I'll paraphrase her. Basically, she was asked why she does all the installation herself, and she said it was because she's worried about the stereotype of the lazy black. She doesn't want people to think she's not doing her own work. Now, given that she has nodded to Andy Warhol as a major influence, I do think it's worth considering that she's saying that as in a performative way. I can't imagine anyone accusing her of being lazy, and especially in the context of the work, which is about slavery. Yes?
Are they always the same figures, or does she?
For this installation, the figures are the same, but their organization is different. So here, I think this is where I have, yeah. So here she's in the middle, here she's off to the side, right?
The colors are
Yes, the transparency appears to be different in each of them. So there is this openness to revision. This guy up here, or floating, he does look like he's sitting in the crook of a tree here, looking down, this sort of balloon man.
So I'm sorry, is this a projection on the wall, but the black silhouettes are actually paper?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. Sorry, yes.
Silhouettes are actually black?
The black silhouettes are paper that's cut out, that she brings into the museum, attaches to the wall. Yes. And then in this case, she has projected this colored transparency into the corner. There are some really wonderful, this cyclorama that she did one piece that's a circular room, and it just goes all the way around, and it's just black and white, so it's a lot easier to read than this one, but I think has things that are seen as not appropriate for high school. But she's using the cyclorama because of its relationship with like sort of early cinema and entertainment culture. She wants these to draw us in. She wants these to be a sort of Gone with the Wind, where we're seduced by the narrative, the drama, the violence, the sex. And the closer you look, the more horrifying it becomes. Something that might look like some sort of plain old pornography, a blowjob, can turn into something really horrifying, like really distressing and violent and terrifying in these contexts. In a Kara Walker, a pornographic image can be the easiest thing to consume sometimes. Because it's the intersection of violence, I think, and sexuality that becomes really disturbing and problematic. And I think that's where artists like Betty Saar were really concerned about the work. Instead of these figures being empowered, she sees them being A, subjugated, and B, often complicit in their subjugation. That there is a sort of affection or an attraction between the slave and the master in her narratives. That's very difficult to talk about or think about today. Has anybody seen Dogville by Lars von Trier? It's very upsetting. Most Americans really don't like it. A Danish filmmaker who's never been to America but made a film about slavery. Formally pretty interesting, but yeah. Any other questions about?
Just back to
Yes.
the gentleman who's lost his leg.
Yes, let's see if I can, there.
What's hanging from his groin? And
That's a great question, and we often see in Walker's work ambiguous objects hanging from the groin or the bottom. Like here, we often see this. And sometimes you can kind of tell, and sometimes you just have no idea what you're looking at. There's one image, I don't think I have it here, but it's like a woman wearing a banana skirt, like Josephine Baker style banana skirt. And then a child is sucking on one of the bananas, and it kind of becomes a phallus in that context. It's pretty gross. It's unpleasant. So this is actually relatively tame in terms of these projections that we don't really know what they are.
The guy hunched over with the two little kids, not in this image.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, like the guy on the right.
Let me find a bigger,
Yeah,
Right there. That's scary.
here.
Is
One
he
more
like,
over.
Oh, yes.
is he like luring them away, or?
Well, okay, so how would you describe them? They're not the same, but what are the qualities of these children?
Oh yeah, one is super like.
One appears to be starving.
Yes.
I think he's the master, and they're both his kids, and one is white and one is black.
Okay, so the underfed one is one of the slave children, and the better fed one is a white child, or, as was often the case, was his son with one of the female slaves, who may have been better fed, right? I mean, that happened all the time. It was very, very common. I mean, we can tell all kinds of stories from this, but the thing to be aware of when we do, we make the stories, right? She gives us signals to get us going, but we make the stories, they're our stories.
Where does she find her images? Did she study photographs, or did she put them in her head, or?
I mean, they come from a variety of sources. Memorabilia, right? So like that Betty Saar image of the Mamie, she collects that kind of stuff, right? Kara Walker collects racist images. But also sometimes, like, she's done works that are based on newspaper articles, descriptions of events, where she is sort of making up the images herself. So it's a combination of a number of different things. Yeah. She's tough, but quite extraordinary.